Welcome to our lecture on mindfulness, a topic I'm sure you've heard of in passing or have maybe tried yourself. To tackle this growing area of psychology, we'll walk through where it comes from and what it means when we say mindfulness. Break it down to a conceptual level thanks to carefully designed smart art, and then review what it means for athletes and practice as a sports psychologist. We begin with a quote from someone who is considered to be a forefather of mindfulness, Jon Kabat-Zinn. He's a professor emeritus of medicine and defined mindfulness as the awareness that arises from paying attention, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. We'll come back to the components of that quote later, but it's important to note here that the idea is to cultivate attention on the body and the mind as it is, moment to moment. Mindfulness is considered to be part of the third wave of behavior therapy. It differs from other forms of therapy in that we're trying to change the function, not the form, of behavior, emotion, cognition, bodily sensations, and external stimuli. Our aim is to change the relationship to thoughts and emotions rather than the content of them. This is best captured by Guerin's quote here. If mindfulness focuses on something, meditation generally focuses on nothing, trying to quiet the mind down to no thoughts. This can be incredibly difficult for some people. Formal mindfulness practice leads to more dispositional mindfulness, which is temporary, the tendency to act more mindfully in everyday life. Increased dispositional mindfulness mediates improvement in psychological functioning, and different facets make different contributions to functioning. So mindfulness can have different effects on our psychology depending on the facets we're focusing on. So what are these facets? Well, to work this out, Coffey and colleagues ran an exploratory, confirmatory, factor analysis, and structural equation modeling. Just quickly, a confirmatory factor analysis is commonly used in social research to test whether measures of a construct are consistent with a researcher's understanding of the nature of that construct, while structural equational modeling is a multivariate statistical analysis technique used to analyze structural relationships between measured variables and potentially hidden constructs. It's a combination of factor analysis and multiple regression. It can be difficult to differentiate between mindfulness components and emotional regulation, but according to the study, there are two facets of mindfulness: person-centered attention and acceptance of experience. They suggested that other components captured in current trait measures of mindfulness are actually the consequence of mindfulness rather than the components themselves. The reason for this might be that the boundaries between mindfulness practice and dispositional mindfulness are not very clear yet. In this quote in Shapiro and colleagues' study in 2006, they speak about the facets of mindfulness as a search for common ground on which to build a more precise understanding of the primary mechanisms of action involved in mindfulness practices that have become increasingly prominent in contemporary psychology and behavioral medicine. An axiom is actually a statement or proposition which is regarded as being established, accepted, or self-evidently true, and that's how we explain the three facets of mindfulness as intention, attention, and attitude. Your intentions set the stage for what is possible. Attention is about suspending all the ways of interpreting experience and attending just to that experience itself. And attitude is a sense of open-hearted, friendly presence and interest. Baer and colleagues investigated the factor structure of mindfulness by combining all items from 5 recently developed individual questionnaires and performing an exploratory factor analysis, which is a multivariate statistical method used to uncover the underlying structure of a relatively large set of variables. Its overarching goal is to identify the relationships between them. And that's something that our understanding of mindfulness needs right now. While mindfulness measures quantify dispositional mindfulness, Bear and colleagues actually conceptualized dispositional mindfulness itself, with a factor analysis leading into 5 factors with the following components: observe, describe, act aware, non-react, and non-judge. So can we actually make any predictions from these factors? They found that some components predict psychological well-being, symptoms of anxiety, depression, and stress. Act aware and non-judge were predictors of depression, while non-judge was also a significant predictor of anxiety. As we mentioned before, different components of dispositional mindfulness make different contributions to our psychological functioning. We also have different mechanisms of mindfulness thanks to the work by Beer and colleagues. The figure on the right shows the connection between 9 mechanisms of mindfulness that they've identified and psychological skills, with arrows representing a relationship between the two. Our mechanisms of mindfulness are bare attention, experiential acceptance, values clarification, self-regulation or negative emotion regulation, clarity about one's internal life, exposure, flexibility, non-attachment, and less rumination. The psychological skills we can see in this figure are personal development and life skills, social skills, recovery skills, coping, motivation, pain management, attention, arousal regulation, perceptual cognitive skills, motor control, communication, and leadership. So we'll take a moment now to look at those mechanisms of mindfulness a little closer. In terms of attitude, mindfulness practice increases experiential acceptance. So athletes accept the performance discrepancy and reinvestment processes are not triggered. We spoke about de-automation in the concentration and focus lecture, and that appears here as well. The tendency to control automize movements with declarative knowledge is actually reduced, and athletes could therefore enhance their performance of well-learned motor skills because the automatic process isn't being interrupted. The occurrence of ironic mental processes would also decrease, which again should favor athletic performance. In terms of values, mindfulness practice leads to clarification of values. Athletes could identify conflicts between personal values and goals and increase self-concordance in the degree of self-determined behavior, which would have a positive effect on their needs. Motivational, personal, developmental, and self skills would profit from clarification of values. Self-regulation or negative emotion regulation can be enhanced by dispositional mindfulness as a result of formal and informal mindfulness practice. Athletes would be better able to deal with anger, fear, and other negative emotions, as well as arousal regulation, coping, communication, and leadership skills too. Clarity about one's internal life can be affected by mindfulness because it leads to better clarity about one's internal feelings and one's ability to control behavior in the presence of negative affect. Better clarity would have a positive effect on personal development, life, self, recovery, coping, communication, and leadership skills. There would potentially be fewer overtrained athletes and dropouts as well. Mindfulness practice leads to more exposure, in particular, the willingness to remain in contact with an unpleasant experience. Athletes would be more willing to endure negative experiences, confront more difficult situations and competition, tend to extend their threshold of pain, and be willing to face aversive training situations. They've also found enhanced pain management and coping skills are a likely consequence. Adaptation, flexibility, and responding to the environment as a result of dispositional mindfulness can promote the consolidation of personal development and self skills, as well as communication and leadership. The belief that one's own happiness is independent of obtaining positive outcomes or non-attachment is a consequence of mindfulness practice. Presumably, non-attachment reduces ironic mental processes and reinvestment, which has a positive effect on personal development, self-recovery, coping, emotive control, and communication and leadership. Mindfulness reduces rumination, or at least the uncontrollability of rumination, and influences almost all of the psychological skills measured in the study. One thing that Shapiro does point out in their study is the goal paradox, which highlights that there may be a discrepancy between some of the mentalities of an elite athlete in comparison to mindfulness practice. The mindfulness practice stems from the Buddhist tradition and is based on an Eastern philosophical belief that the source of suffering is an uncontrolled mind guided by anger, attachment, and ignorance. The goal of mindfulness meditation is therefore often to liberate one's desire and will. This contradicts an athlete's goal to win competitions. Athletes are often driven by will and desire, dedicated to training for outcome goals, and may place self-worth in their achievements. A revered Olympic swimmer is famously quoted for saying, "He who thinks of winning loses." He recognized that thoughts on winning were distracting him from the task at hand and would inhibit the delivery of automated processes. So the presence of mindfulness in sport might be more prevalent than we first thought, with successful athletes already seeming to use attitudes conjoint with mindfulness, like focusing on the present moment, accepting an unpleasant experience such as physical pain, and practicing consistently. The problem with the application of mindfulness is that it's far from a psychological skill or quick fix. Some sports may be reluctant to incorporate such a long-term intervention or practice, and of course it's difficult to develop the discipline required for ongoing mindfulness practice. That being said, training and practice aspects adhering to mindfulness meditation is actually very similar to the demands of training in sport. That being said, the training and practice aspect inherent to mindfulness meditation are very similar to the demands of training in sport. So performance is mostly seen as an outcome of years-long training processes. So mindfulness being an ongoing process demanding hundreds of hours of continual practice shouldn't be difficult to reconcile as an elite athlete. It also requires the right attitude, namely non-judgmental, acceptance, openness, and self-respect, and non-reactivity, which may be at odds with the personality of the athlete. As always, we want to know, does it work? Well, there are two sport-specific mindfulness-based intervention programs that are being developed, namely the Mindfulness Acceptance Commitment Approach and the Mindfulness Sport Performance Enhancement Approach. There is some evidence that dispositional mindfulness is related to more flow, less fear, and fewer task-irrelevant thoughts. But in 2012, only 8 empirical studies had investigated mindfulness in sports, or at least mindfulness-based interventions with athletes. Today, we will discuss 2 of them, the single case study by Schwanhauser and one intervention study examining the MSPE program. So Kaufman and colleagues used the Mindfulness Sports Performance Enhancement Program with 32 recreational athletes, 11 archers, and 21 golfers. The program required 4 sessions, 1 per week, and only 11 participants attended all of them, with an average of about 2.97 sessions attended, with the remaining 29 participants. It was hypothesized that archers and golfers who participated in an MSPE workshop would experience reductions in sport anxiety, perfectionism, and thought disruption, as well as growth in sport confidence. They would also become more mindful, display greater elevations in performance, and be more likely to enter flow while participating in their sport. Anxiety, perfectionism, and thought disruption were expected to be inversely related to flow, while confidence and mindfulness were expected to rate positively. The MSP program itself is a combination of elements from Kabat-Zinn's mindfulness-based stress reduction and Segal's mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. The program was designed in combination with personal communication with coaches in both sports and other mentally demanding sports like tennis. The program is shortened to 4 weeks with 2.5 to 3 hour sessions. 9 different scales were used as measures of mindfulness and related components, with 2 questionnaires pre and post intervention and a daily mindfulness log and sport performance log. That's a lot of things to complete. So these are the psychological variables that were measured in the study, and this is a common table to find in this line of work. It denotes the differences in scores on the various measures across the 4 weeks of the intervention, where the symbols on the right-hand side indicate a statistically significant result. In psychology, we use 0.05 as a common level of significance. So 0.10, in other regards, would be considered almost significant. You'll note that the 9 components of flow are listed here, which we spoke about in the concentration and focus lecture, but only curiosity and decentering in terms of mindfulness-based measures that were used to collect this information. In terms of the findings, the level of state flow achieved by athletes during weekly performances changed significantly over the course of training. These changes are in the level of overall state flow and unambiguous feedback. No changes in trait flow were observed, but it would take longer for a personality change to occur than to influence an athletic event. Significant changes were also found in the golfer's state mindfulness, with higher decentering by the training's end. Now, Rotella and Cullen suggest that if emotions such as anger overwhelm golfers, they can lose their judgment regarding strategy and can compound an initial error with subsequent errors until their round is ruined, highlighting the potential importance of decentering to performance. Archers experienced a trend towards significant change in overall state mindfulness, especially in the curiosity component, which is just a nice way of saying that it was almost significant but not quite statistically. A significant change in dimensions of dispositional mindfulness, but not flow, was observed despite a strong positive relationship between the two. Adversely, both athlete types became more perfectionistic following the MSPE program, which is at odds with the concept of mindfulness. Now let's take a look at the mindfulness acceptance commitment approach to performance enhancement, which is a step-by-step protocol developed to enhance task relevant attention and poise. This is defined as the capacity to act in one's own best interest and function in the service of performance values regardless of thoughts and emotions. The primary objectives of the MAC program are to enhance awareness and acceptance of internal cognitive and affective states, enhance willingness to experience a wide range of internal experiences, including negative or distressing experiences, enhance attention to task-relevant stimuli, and act in a manner that is in accordance with one's stated values. This case study featured an adolescent diver receiving the MAC Performance Enhancement Program with modifications to make it appropriate for an adolescent. The program consisted of 9 individual sessions. targeting attention and value-driven behavior with self-report measures of mindfulness and flow and objective measures of performance. So here are two of the figures included in the study, which shows how the young diver performed on 3 scales for mindfulness and acceptance and their diving performance throughout the program. While the changes in performance are notable, it would be difficult to discern whether or not this was just from 9 weeks of training and whether mindfulness and acceptance played a mediating role. But it is an indication of how mindfulness might influence performance. Changes in these measures indicate a general increase in mindful awareness and acceptance of internal experiences, as well as the ability to maintain mindful attention. More specifically, changes in the AAQ-2 suggest a significant increase in experiential acceptance of cognitions, emotions, and physical sensations. Increases in the MAAS and the PHMS were consistent with Steve's self-report of increased ability to be non-judgmentally aware and accepting of his experiences while remaining focused on the present moment. Objective diving performance, as measured by scores in both 1 meter and 3 meter springboard diving competitions, indicated a significant and substantial increase in his competitive performance. As you may have noticed by now, case studies don't really hold much value in the world of psychological research. Given one of the biggest obstacles that we have to consistently overcome is the individual differences between people. The experience of one adolescent diver may never be replicated again, but it is an indication of the potential value of mindfulness in sport. So just a quick recap to finish. We have a number of facets of mindfulness, which include intention, attention and attitude, and or observe, describe, act aware, non-react, and non-judge. There are 9 mechanisms of mindfulness according to Bira, and 2 interventions that are appearing in research with sport and athletes. If you're still curious about mindfulness, there is a link to a Netflix episode in the comments of this slide. And just remember that while meditation is about emptying your mind, mindfulness is about observing it without judgment. Thank you for listening.